Welcome back, history enthusiasts. Picture this. It's June 1775. Smoke fills the air, musket fire echoes across the hills, and a group of determined colonial fighters stands face to face with the mighty British Army. What unfolded on the battlefield would become one of the most legendary clashes of the American Revolution. Today, we're diving into the story of the Battle of Bunker Hill, a battle that proved courage and determination could challenge even the world's most powerful military force. We'll explore why the battle happened, how it was fought, and why its impact changed the course of American history forever. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our fascinating journeys through history. Now, let's travel back to 1775 and uncover the incredible story of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Boston was situated on a peninsula at the time and was largely protected from close approach by the expanses of water surrounding it, which were dominated by British warships. In the aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord on the 19th of April, 1775, the colonial militia of some 15,000 men had surrounded the town and besieged it under the command of Artemas Ward. They controlled the only land access to Boston itself, the Roxbury Neck, but they were unable to contest British domination of the waters of the harbor. The British troops occupied the city, a force of about 6,000 under the command of General Thomas Gage, and they were able to be resupplied and reinforced by sea. However, the land across the water from Boston contained a number of hills which could be used to advantage. Artillery could be placed on the hills and used to bombard the city until the occupying army evacuated it or surrendered. It was with this in mind that Henry Knox led the noble train of artillery to transport cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. The Charlestown Peninsula to the north of Boston started from a short, narrow isthmus known as the Charlestown Neck and extended about 1 mile southeastward into Boston Harbor. Bunker Hill had an elevation of 110 feet and lay at the northern end of the peninsula. Breed's Hill had a height of 62 feet and was more southerly and nearer to Boston. The American soldiers were at an advantage due to the height of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, but it also essentially trapped them at the top. The settled part of the town of Charlestown occupied flats at the southern end of the peninsula. At its closest approach, less than 1,000 feet separated the Charlestown Peninsula from the Boston Peninsula, where Copp's Hill was at about the same height as Breed's Hill. The British retreat from Concord had ended in Charlestown, but General Gage did not fortify the hills on the peninsula, but instead withdrew his troops to Boston, turning the entire Charlestown Peninsula into a no man's land. British planning. The British received reinforcements throughout May until they reached a strength of about 6,000 men. Generals William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton arrived on May 25 aboard HMS Cerberus. Gage began planning with them to break out of the city, finalizing a plan on June 12. This plan began with taking the Dorchester Neck, fortifying the Dorchester Heights, and then marching on the colonial forces stationed in Roxbury. Once the southern flank had been secured, the Charlestown Heights would be taken and the forces in Cambridge driven away. The attack was set for June 18. On June 13, the Committee of Safety in Exeter, New Hampshire, notified the Massachusetts Provincial Congress that a New Hampshire gentleman of undoubted veracity had overheard the British commanders making plans to capture Dorchester and Charlestown. On June 15, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety decided that additional defenses needed to be erected. General Ward directed General Israel Putnam to set up defenses on the Charlestown Peninsula, specifically on Bunker Hill.
Gentlemen, the enemy is here. We must move now.
But sir, our supplies are low. Our lines can hold, but we need reinforcements.
Agreed. Prepare the orders. At once, sir.
Array of American forces for the Battle of Bunker Hill. On the night of June 16, Colonial Colonel William Prescott led about 1,200 men onto the peninsula in order to set up positions from which artillery fire could be directed into Boston. This force was made up of men from the regiments Prescott. Putnam, the unit, was commanded by Thomas Knowlton, James Fry, and Ebenezer Bridge. At first, Putnam, Prescott, and their engineer Captain Richard Gridley disagreed as to where they should locate their defense. Some work was performed on Bunker Hill, but Breed's Hill was closer to Boston and viewed as being more defensible, and they decided to build their primary redoubt there. Prescott and his men began digging a square fortification about 130 feet on a side with ditches and earthen walls. The walls of the redoubt were about 6 feet high, with a wooden platform inside on which men could stand and fire over the walls. The works on Breed's Hill did not go unnoticed by the British. General Clinton was out on reconnaissance that night and was aware of them, and he tried to convince Gage and Howe that they needed to prepare to attack the position at daylight. British sentries were also aware of the activity, but most apparently did not think it cause for alarm. A sentry on board HMS Lively spotted the new fortification around 4 a.m. and notified his captain. Lively opened fire, temporarily halting the colonists' work. Admiral Samuel Graves awoke aboard his flagship HMS Somerset, irritated by the gunfire that he had not ordered. He stopped it, only to have General Gage countermand his decision when he became fully aware of the situation in the morning. He ordered all 128 guns in the harbor to fire on the Colonial position, along with batteries atop Copp's Hill in Boston. The barrage had relatively little effect, as the hilltop fortifications were high enough to frustrate accurate aiming from the ships, and far enough from Copp's Hill to render the batteries there ineffective. The shots that did manage to land, however, were able to kill 1 American soldier and damage the entire supply of water brought for the troops. The Rising Sun also alerted Prescott to a significant problem with the location of the redoubt. It could easily be flanked on either side. He promptly ordered his men to begin constructing a breastwork running down the hill to the east, deciding that he did not have the manpower to also build additional defenses to the west of the redoubt. British preparations. The British generals met to discuss their options. General Clinton had urged an attack as early as possible, and he preferred an attack beginning from the Charlestown Neck that would cut off the colonists' retreat, reducing the process of capturing the new redoubt to one of starving out its occupants. However, he was outvoted by the other 3 generals, who were concerned that his plan violated the convention of the time to not allow one's army to become trapped between enemy forces. Howe was the senior officer present and would lead the assault, and he was of the opinion that the hill was open and easy of ascent and, in short, would be easily carried. General Burgoyne concurred, arguing that the untrained rabble would be no match for their trained troops. Orders were then issued to prepare the expedition. General Gage surveyed the works from Boston with his staff, and Loyalist Abijah Willard recognized his brother-in-law, Colonel Prescott. "Will he fight?" asked Gage. "As to his men, I cannot answer for them," replied Willard, "but Colonel Prescott will fight you to the gates of hell." Prescott lived up to Willard's word, but his men were not so resolute. When the colonists suffered their first casualty, Prescott gave orders to bury the man quickly and quietly, but a large group of men gave him a solemn funeral instead, with several deserting shortly thereafter. It took 6 hours for the British to organize an infantry force and to gather up and inspect the men on parade. General Howe was to lead the major assault, driving around the Colonial left flank and taking them from the rear. Brigadier General Robert Piggott on the British left flank would lead the direct assault on the redoubt, and Major John Pitcairn would lead the flank or reserve force. It took several trips in longboats to transport Howe's initial forces, consisting of about 1,500 men, to the eastern corner of the peninsula, known as Moulton's Point. By 2 p.m., Howe's chosen force had landed. However, while crossing the river, Howe noted the large number of Colonial troops on top of Bunker Hill. He believed these to be reinforcements and immediately sent a message to Gage requesting additional troops. He then ordered some of the light infantry to take a forward position along the eastern side of the peninsula, alerting the colonists to his intended course of action. The troops then sat down to eat while they waited for the reinforcements. The first British attack on Bunker Hill. Shaded areas are hills. Colonists reinforced their positions. Prescott saw the British preparations and called for reinforcements. Among the reinforcements were Joseph Warren, the popular young leader of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, and Seth Pomeroy, an aging Massachusetts militia leader. Both of these men held commissions of rank, but chose to serve as infantry. Prescott ordered the Connecticut men under Captain Knowlton to defend the left flank, where they used a crude dirt wall as a breastwork and topped it with fence rails and hay. They also constructed 3 small V-shaped trenches between this dirt wall and Prescott's breastwork. Troops that arrived to reinforce this flank position included about 200 men from the 1st and 3rd New Hampshire regiments under Colonels John Stark and James Reed. Stark's men did not arrive until after Howe landed his forces, and thus filled a gap in the defense that Howe could have taken advantage of had he pressed his attack sooner. They took positions along the breastwork on the northern end of the Colonial position. Low tide opened a gap along the Mystic River to the north, so they quickly extended the fence with a short stone wall to the water's edge. Colonel Stark placed a stake about 100 feet in front of the fence and ordered that no one fire until the British regulars passed it. Further reinforcements arrived just before the battle, including portions of Massachusetts regiments of Colonels Brewer, Nixon, Woodbridge, Little, and Major Moore, as well as Callender's company of artillery. Confusion reigned behind the Colonial lines. Many units sent toward the action stopped before crossing the Charlestown Neck from Cambridge, which was under constant fire from gun batteries to the south. Others reached Bunker Hill, but then were uncertain where to go from there and just milled around. One commentator wrote of the scene that, "It appears to me there never was more confusion and less command. General Putnam was on the scene attempting to direct affairs, but unit commanders often misunderstood or even disobeyed orders." British assault. The second British attack on Bunker Hill. By 3 p.m., the British reinforcements had arrived, which included the 47th Regiment of Foot and the 1st Marines, and the British were ready to march. Brigadier General Pigot's force were gathering just south of Charlestown Village, and they were already taking casualties from sniper fire from the settlement. Howe asked Admiral Graves for assistance in clearing out the snipers. Graves had planned for such a possibility and ordered a carcass fired into the village, and then sent a landing party to set fire to the town. The smoke billowing from Charlestown lent an almost surreal backdrop to the fighting, as the winds were such that the smoke was kept from the field of battle. First attack. General Howe led the light infantry companies and grenadiers in the assault on the American left flank along the rail fence, expecting an easy effort against Stark's recently arrived troops. His light infantry were set along the narrow beach in column formation. In order to turn the far left flank of the Colonial position, the grenadiers were deployed in the center, lining up 4 deep and several hundred across. Pigot was commanding the 5th, 38th, 43rd, 47th, and 52nd regiments, as well as Major Pitcairn's Marines. They were to feint an assault on the redoubt. Just before the British advanced, the American position along the rail fence was reinforced by 2 pieces of artillery from Bunker Hill. Howe had intended the advance to be preceded by an artillery bombardment from the field pieces present, but it was soon discovered that these cannon had been supplied with the wrong caliber of ammunition, delaying the assault. Attacking Breed's Hill presented an array of difficulties. The hay on the hillside had not been harvested, requiring that the regulars march through waist-high grass which concealed the uneven terrain beneath. The pasture land of the hillside was covered with crisscrossing rail fences, hampering the cohesion of marching formations. The regulars were loaded down with gear wholly unnecessary for the attack, and the British troops were overheating in their wool uniforms under the heat of the afternoon sun, compounded by the nearby inferno from Charlestown. The colonists withheld their fire until the regulars were within at least 50 paces of their position. As the regulars closed in range, they suffered heavy casualties from Colonial fire. The colonists benefited from the rail fence to steady and aim their muskets and enjoyed a modicum of cover from return fire. Under this withering fire, the light companies melted away and retreated, some as far as their boats. James Abercrombie, commanding the grenadiers, was fatally wounded. Pigot's attacks on the redoubt and breastworks fared little better. By stopping and exchanging fire with the colonists, the regulars were fully exposed and suffered heavy losses. They continued to be harried by snipers in Charlestown, and Pigot ordered a retreat after seeing what happened to Howe's advance. By the time the first attack had petered out, 96 British regulars had been killed. Second attack. The regulars reformed on the field and marched out again, this time navigating a field strewn with dead and wounded comrades. This time, Pigot was not to feint. He was to assault the redoubt directly, possibly without the assistance of Howe's force. Howe advanced against Knowlton's position along the rail fence, instead of marching against Stark's position along the beach. The outcome of the second attack was very much the same as the first. One British observer wrote, Most of our grenadiers and light infantry, the moment of presenting themselves, lost 3/4 and many 9/10 of their men. Some had only 8 or 9 men a company left. Pickett's attack did not enjoy any greater success than Howe, and he ordered a retreat after almost 30 minutes of firing ineffective volleys at the Colonial position. The second attack had failed.
Soldiers advance! Hold the line! Charge the hill for liberty! Huzzah for the colonies!
Meanwhile, confusion continued in the rear of the Colonial forces. General Putnam tried, with limited success, to send additional troops from Bunker Hill to the forward positions on Breed's Hill to support the embattled regiments. One Colonial observer wrote to Samuel Adams afterwards, "It appears to me that there was never more confusion and less command. Some companies and leaderless groups of men moved toward the field, others retreated. They were running low on powder and ammunition, and the Colonial regiments suffered from a hemorrhage of deserters." By the time that the third attack came, there were only 700 and 800 men left on Breed's Hill, with only 150 inches the redoubt. Connecticut's Captain John Chester saw an entire company in retreat and ordered his company to aim muskets at them to halt the retreat. They turned about and headed back to the battlefield. The third and final British attack on Bunker Hill. The British rear was also in disarray. Wounded soldiers that were mobile had made their way to the landing areas and were being ferried back to Boston, while the wounded lying on the field of battle were the source of moans and cries of pain. Third attack. Howe sent word to Clinton in Boston for additional troops. Clinton had observed the first two attacks and sent around 400 men from the 2nd Marines and the 63rd Foot and followed himself to help rally the troops. In addition to these reserves, he convinced around 200 walking wounded to form up for the third attack. The third assault was to concentrate squarely on the redoubt, with only a feint on the colonist flank. Howe ordered his men to remove their heavy packs and leave all unnecessary equipment behind. He arrayed his forces in column formation rather than the extended order of the first two assaults, exposing fewer men along the front to Colonial fire. The third attack was made at the point of the bayonet and successfully carried the redoubt. However, the final volleys of fire from the colonists cost the life of Major Pitcairn. The defenders had run out of ammunition, reducing the battle to close quarters combat. The advantage turned to the British, as their troops were equipped with bayonets on their muskets, while most of the colonists were not. Colonel Prescott, one of the last men to leave the redoubt, parried bayonet thrusts with his normally ceremonial saber. British forces killed 30 defenders in the melee and forced the rest into a retreat. It is during the retreat from the redoubt that Joseph Warren was shot in the face and killed. British ships rained iron shot down on the neck, killing a number of Americans, including Major Andrew McClary. The retreat of much of the Colonial forces from the peninsula was made possible in part by the controlled withdrawal of the forces along the rail fence, led by John Stark and Thomas Knowlton, which prevented the encirclement of the hill. Burgoyne described their orderly retreat as no flight. It was even covered with bravery and military skill. It was so effective that most of the wounded were saved. Most of the prisoners taken by the British were mortally wounded. General Putnam attempted to reform the troops on Bunker Hill, however. The flight of the Colonial forces was so rapid that artillery pieces and entrenching tools had to be abandoned. The colonists suffered most of their casualties during the retreat on Bunker Hill. By 5 p.m., the colonists had retreated over the Charlestown Neck to fortified positions in Cambridge, and the British were in control of the peninsula. Aftermath. The Bunker Hill Monument. Ralph Farnham, one of the last survivors. The British had taken the ground, but at a great loss. They had suffered 1,054 casualties, 226 dead and 828 wounded, a 40% casualty rate, and a disproportionate number of these were from the elite light infantry and grenadiers. 19 officers had been killed. 81. The casualty count was the highest suffered by the British in any single encounter during the entire war. General Clinton paraphrased Pyrrhus of Epirus, remarking in his diary that a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. British dead and wounded included 100 commissioned officers, a significant portion of the British officer corps in America. Much of General Howe's field staff was among the casualties. General Gage reported the following officer casualties in his report after the battle, listing lieutenants and above by name. 1 lieutenant colonel killed, 2 majors killed, 3 wounded, 7 captains killed, 27 wounded, 9 lieutenants killed, 32 wounded, 15 sergeants killed, 42 wounded, 1 drummer killed, 12 wounded. Colonial losses were about 450
Stay together, men. Push
inches
on.
total,
They're burning
of whom
everything.
138
To the
were
woods.
killed.
Don't stop.
Most of the
Up for the
Colonial
children.
losses came during the withdrawal. Major Andrew McClary was technically the highest-ranking Colonial officer to die in the battle. He was hit by cannon fire on Charlestown Neck, the last person to be killed in the battle. He was hit by cannon fire on Charlestown Neck, the last person to be killed in the battle. He was later commemorated by the dedication of Fort McClary in Kittery, Maine. A serious loss to the Patriot cause, however, was the death of Joseph Warren. He was the president of Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and he had been appointed a major general on June 14. His commission had not yet taken effect when he served as a volunteer private 3 days later at Bunker Hill. Only 30 men were captured by the British, most of them with grievous wounds. 20 died while held prisoner. The Colonials also lost numerous shovels and other entrenching tools, as well as 5 out of the 6 cannons that they had brought to the peninsula.